All right, so today we're going to look at answering the 5 questions that you had from my Dungeon Shook. Now, these questions range from interpreting, analyzing, all the way through the notice and note. They're, in theory, supposed to get slightly more difficult and longer as you go on. This isn't always the case for these types of questions, but a majority of the time it is. Now, what's tricky about these types of questions, and it's like this throughout the book, is that you should not be responding with 1-sentence answers or 2-sentence answers. All of these should be elaborate responses. What do I mean by elaborate responses? Well, when you write an essay, what are the 3 things that you must have in every single paragraph? Well, claim, evidence, warrant. The same thing applies to these questions. You should have a claim, also known as a topic sentence in this case. You should provide evidence to support your claim, and then you should have a warrant. So how does your evidence relate to the claim that you're making? If you're missing one of these components in these questions, your response is not complete. So these responses should take you some time. They shouldn't be something that you just finish in a couple of minutes, right? Especially when you're finding thorough evidence. So let's start with the first one. Baldwin refers to innocence throughout the text. As Baldwin uses the word, does it carry a positive or negative connotation? Cite specific examples in your response. So we talked at some point earlier in the year the difference between connotation and denotation. So think to yourself, in order to answer this question, what is connotation versus denotation? Well, denotation would be like the dictionary definition of a word. What is the literal meaning of innocence? But this question is asking about connotation, and connotation is how it comes across, or what's the implied meaning. Is it positive or is it negative? Typically, if somebody's innocent, that's a good thing, right? But in this case, it's a little bit different, and you'll notice that as you actually read through this text. So if we go through first the actual text, first we have to find where in the text he actually talks about innocence. And one of the key examples of this is in paragraph 5, right? He says, "This innocent country set you down in a ghetto, in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish." So he's saying it set you down in a ghetto, which is not a good thing, and intended for you to perish, aka die. Let me spell it out precisely what I mean by that, for the heart of the matter is here, and the root of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born, and faced the future that you faced because you were black, and for no other reason. So if you read through this text, you should know he's talking about the differences, essentially, between the Black American and the white American. And he's saying, like, these conditions are unfair, right? We're set into this world not under the same conditions as our white counterparts. Because remember, if you read the paragraph right before this letter started, it explains that he's talking about he's writing during the civil rights movement, right? Which is a very hostile time in America. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out the brutal clarity, and in as many ways as possible, that you are a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You weren't expected to have dreams of being excellent. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity, meaning you were expected to be okay with just, getting by. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time on earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do, and how you could do it, and where you could live and whom you could marry. I know your countrymen do not agree with me about this, and I hear them saying, "You exaggerate. They do not know Harlem, and I do. So do you. Take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your experience." So in this paragraph in general, in paragraph 5, he's calling Americans in a lot of ways, meaning the white Americans, innocent. And does he mean that they're innocent? Like they're not, they don't really know? No, he's implying they know exactly what they're doing. Which means that this is a negative connotation. Now, if we continue into paragraph 6, know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there really is no limit to where you can go. The details and symbols of your life have deliberately constructed to make you believe that what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. So if you were confused on whether or not innocent is meaning, a positive thing or a negative thing, this paragraph should let you in. He's saying, don't listen to them. Don't let them tell you you can't be excellent, because you can. So just please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful herd today, and the reality which lies beyond the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there's no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them, and accept them with love. For these, again, this word, innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So we know, going back to our question, that this word, innocent, carries a very, very heavy negative connotation. So we need to start our response with this claim, because maybe there's an argument in the opposite, but in this case, I don't think there is. So Baldwin refers to innocence throughout the text in a way in such a way, I'm going to put in such a way that it carries a negative connotation. While innocence usually carries a positive connotation, Baldwin uses it instead to convey a lack of guilt. Now, we need to provide some sort of evidence for this. So you could use a couple different things from the text. Instead of using direct quotes in this case, I'm going to try to sum up kind of what he's saying, because it's really hard to pull direct quotes for every single thing. So you can paraphrase. You should try to use direct quotes, but in this case, it'll just be a little bit awkward because we only have this one word, and so you kind of have to walk your audience through what you're saying rather than give them that one-liner. Baldwin used it instead to convey a lack of guilt. He refers, you could do it in this sense, he refers to the white counterparts as these innocent people. He refers to his white counterparts, innocent people, to indicate that they are not truly innocent, but I would say ignorant to the reality of the average Black man living in America. So, innocence to Baldwin suggests a lack of understanding, which again is what I'm referring to with the word ignorant, but we have to really spell it out in our warrant. So innocence to Baldwin suggests a lack of understanding. And actually, we could just stop it there. So if we were to break this down, we do have our claim. So Baldwin refers to innocence throughout the text in a way that carries a negative connotation. We have our evidence. Innocence normally carries a positive connotation. He uses it to convey a lack of guilt. He refers to counterpart as innocent people, indicating that they are not truly innocent, but ignorant to the reality of the average Black man living in America. So this is our evidence. And then we have our warrant. And again, like I said, the first couple questions are supposed to be the easiest. It's supposed to get you warmed up into this. Therefore, our response is the shortest. I don't know how we'll play out with the rest of these, but we can assume that it will be the shortest for this particular assignment. So let's look at the second one. In the letter, which details are directed to his nephew and which to a wider audience? Look specifically at paragraphs 2, 3, and 6. So they're directing us to paragraphs 2, 3, and 6, so we're going to specifically look at those paragraphs. You should not be pulling from other paragraphs. It told you where to go. Now, you should have taken away from the notes that you did from the video that an open letter is kind of addressed to two parties at once. So it's definitely addressed to Baldwin's nephew, who he says the letter is actually addressed to. And then it's also addressed to a wider audience because remember, an open letter is published somewhere publicly where, everybody can read it. Okay, so we're looking for what is addressed to the nephew versus what is addressed to a wider audience. In order to find this, we have to go back to paragraphs 2, 3, and 6, which we just read 6, most of 6. So I'm going to go ahead and not bother with that one. But I will start with paragraph 2. I have known both of you all your lives, have carried your daddy in my arms and on my shoulders, kissed and spanked him, and watched him learn to walk. I don't know if you've known anybody from that far back, if you've loved anybody that long, first as an infant, then as a child, then as a man. You gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. Other people cannot see what I see whenever I look into your father's face, for behind your father's face, as it is today, are all those other faces which were his. Let him laugh, and I see a cellar your father does not remember, and a house he does not remember, and I hear his present laughter, his laughter as a child. I hear in his present laughter his laughter as a child. Let him curse, and I remember him falling down the cellar steps and howling, and I remember with pain his tears which my hand or your grandmother so easily wiped away. But no one's hand can wipe away those tears he sheds invisibly today, which one hears in his laughter and in his speech and in his songs. I know what the world has done to my brother and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know which is much worse, and this is the crime for which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed, one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been has been best at since we have heard of. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. Now, my dear namesake, these innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described by us or Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago. I hear the chorus of innocents screaming, "No, this is not true. How bitter you are." But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them, for most of them do not yet really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother was also there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest that the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. So going back to the question, we're supposed to find the details that are directed to the nephew versus the wider audience. And if we see in these two paragraphs, there are many times, for example, in paragraph 2, Baldwin is saying, "I've known you and your dad. You carry his face." Every time he's saying you, he's referring to the nephew, right? And he also refers to the father quite a bit. But then he shifts, and he kind of, under the table in a kind of sneaky way, starts talking about how white Americans specifically, need to take responsibility for their inadvertent support for the inequality. So where he's talking in paragraph 3, for example, the innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, this would be where he's referring to the white counterparts, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed. And he's like, I hear the chorus of innocents screaming, no. This is not necessarily directed to the nephew, but more the wider audience, trying to say like, hey, if you're not actively trying to change this problem, you are part of the problem. Okay, so let's see if we can wrap this up in a nutshell. So, Baldwin addresses both his nephew and a wider audience, specifically the white American within his letter. Details such as the personal memories of the boy's father, his dear namesake, which is what he refers to his nephew as, and his directions on how to handle them are all meant to be directed at Baldwin's nephew. Now, this is one part of this, so I'm going to go ahead and throw a warrant in here, and then I'll give more evidence for what's being addressed to the wider audience, because this is kind of a two-part question. Let's see. How to handle them are all meant to be directed towards Baldwin's nephew. He tells his nephew not to be like white people, but to accept them with love. Baldwin uses these intimate details and pieces of advice to really, in a lot of ways, to really connect with his nephew. I don't know why nephew's getting spelled funny today. Now, what's being addressed to the wider audience? So we read about, if you're not fighting against it, you're part of the problem, right? Details pertaining to, I'm going to say details pertaining to the innocence. So details pertaining to the innocence are given. I'm actually going to refer to this, change this a little bit up. So anytime the innocents, and I know it's going to come up as spelled wrong, but that's how he refers to them, are referred to, Baldwin is addressing a wider audience. He suggests that white Americans need to take responsibility for their inadvertent support for inequality. And you can frame this with more evidence by talking about the Charles Dickens illusion. But for time's sake, I'm gonna leave it as is. This would still be an adequate response. I'm gonna leave it as is. So he suggests that white Americans need to take responsibility for their inadvertent support equality. That's the main message of what he's saying. You could also say if white Americans understand Baldwin's message to his nephew, then they should cease fearing they will lose their own identity as they allow Black Americans to shape their own. So this whole fear around this, letting Black Americans have more rights, is that white Americans will lose some if Black Americans have some. And it sounds like a really stupid idea for us, right? But this was a really common thought, and you can run with that here. But again, we do have a sufficient answer. You can make it more detailed, but this is fine. All right, let's move to question 3. What is Baldwin's overall message? Explain whether Baldwin conveys his message effectively to both his nephew and to wider audience. Cite evidence in your response. So what is his message? So Baldwin's message to his nephew is really clear, right? So Baldwin's overall message to his nephew is that no one is that he should not let anyone define who he is. So his argument to his nephew is stated in concrete, which means it's actually there, terms, and supported with examples that young James, which is the name, can understand. And you can actually, if you want to give explicit evidence for this, you could look in the beginning. So I keep seeing your face. There's the face of your father and brother like him. You are tough, dark, vulnerable, moody, with a very definite tendency to sound truculent. because you want no one to think you are soft. You may be like your grandfather in this, I don't know. I'm sure that your father has told you something about all that. Neither you nor your father exhibit any tendency towards holiness. You really are of another era, part of what happened when the Negro left the land and came to land and came into what the late E. Franklin Fraser called the cities of destruction. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a nigger. Pardon the vulgarity there, but it's in the text. So I can tell you this because I love you. Please don't ever forget it. This is really what he's saying. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white man calls this N-word. He tells his nephew, you can only be destroyed, I believe is what he actually says. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are and is that in quotes? No. Okay. So I'm gonna change this around. You notice I'm not using in-text citations. In shorter texts, you should still use in-text citations. For these, I don't require it because I pretty much know where it comes from. If you're doing something from a longer text, like a novel, for example, then you would definitely need in-text citations. Now, I'm just going to move this sentence because for the sake of, I like to have my evidence before my warrant when at all possible. And this is my evidence for, the warrant that would have been this sentence. His argument to his nephew is stated in concrete terms, etc. Now, we have a second part of this. Baldwin's argument to the wider public is also passionately stated. He offers rebuttals to expected criticism, but there aren't as many examples of white cruelty to support some of the claims, nor is there a direct call to action. So now we got to make a statement. Okay, so is the argument effective, right? Because this is also part of this. I would make the argument that his argument to his nephew is very effective. He's very passionate. He's got personal experience. When you're speaking to a family member and when you've literally gone through what they're going through, then you have every right to give those examples, right? But his argument to the wider audience or to the white American is not as clear. Therefore, it's not as effective. You have to really be looking for it in some places to that read in between the lines, so to say, to get his point. So in this sense, Baldwin's, and you could make a different claim to this, right? You could disagree with me and say, it is effective and have other evidence, and that's fine. In this sense, Baldwin's argument to his wider audience is not as effective as his argument to his nephew, which is pretty sound. Okay, and that's all I'm going to leave it as. You definitely could, and you probably should expand on this, but the response here is sufficient. Now, moving to number 4. Analyze. The title of this letter, My Dungeon Shook, is an allusion to a popular spiritual, which in turn alludes to a biblical story. How does this allusion support Baldwin's claim that his nephew is worthy in his own right? How might it resonate with the white Americans reading this letter? So, to know what he's talking about, you would have had to read the footnote, which unfortunately is not coming up on my screen. Sorry about that, but I'll read it for you out of the textbook. So, My Dungeon Shook is, if you have your book in front of you, the last sentence of paragraph 6, it says, you come from a long line of great poets, and some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, the very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and the chains fell off. The footnote at the end of the text for that very line says, this is a quotation from the traditional spiritual, My Dungeon Shook. It alludes to the biblical story of Paul and Silas in Acts 16, which is like the chapter of the book, chapter and verse. The chapter and verse of the Bible, if you're not familiar with this. It's like the equivalent of a surah. Who were freed from an unjust imprisonment by the action of an earthquake. So these two people in the Bible were freed from an unjust imprisonment. So they were put in jail and they were like wrongly convicted, and an earthquake shattered the prison and it made them free. Now, the question is asking us, how does this allusion support Baldwin's claim that his nephew is worthy in his own right? Well, the composers of the spiritual were the poets of the enslaved, and the biblical reference was meant to give enslaved people hope. Baldwin is essentially connecting enslaved people to the Black American, right? Even though they're not physically, at least most of them, no longer physically in chains, they are still enchained figuratively. They're not allowed the same rights. They have, if you're not familiar with the civil rights movement, they, couldn't ride the same buses, or if they did sit on the bus, they had to give their seat up to a white person. They couldn't drink out of the same water fountains. A Black person could not marry a white person and vice versa. There were all these rules that kept the Black American community from truly being free, which is why we still today, side note, we still have a lot of problems in America, because some people do not recognize counterparts in America of color, of any color, any shade, as being their equal, and that's according to our Constitution, that's not right. Now, back to the question. So how does this allusion support Baldwin's claim that his nephew is worthy of his own right? Well, first, let's write what I said. Let's explain. The composers of the spiritual were the poets of the enslaved. And the biblical reference was meant to give the enslaved. It was meant to give, no, I was right. Enslaved people hope. Baldwin uses the reference to give his nephew hope and to tie James's fight for dignity to that of his ancestors. Now, this is the purpose of the illusion, to tie the struggle of the current black man in America to the black, the original Africans that were actually, physically drugged from their home country to America to work as slaves for generations and generations and generations. Now, notice I don't have explicit textual evidence for this one, and that's because there kind of isn't any in a lot of ways. You could maybe quote from the footnote, but because this is an illusion, like, you have to defend it. You could defend this in the sense that using explicit evidence from where he talks about the struggle, but it is difficult to do. So I am, in a way, more synthesizing the argument than giving explicit evidence for this one. And in a question like this, that's understandable. You should still always try to use explicit textual evidence, but using a mix is fine. And if this is the only question you don't use explicit evidence for, it's not a big deal. Now, white Americans on the other side are not really, they could read this illusion completely differently. So white Americans might read the illusion and think that Baldwin was calling black Americans to fight for equality, which may alarm some of them. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how? I don't read it as that. Well, you know what? I really, to be honest with you, I could easily come up with a counter argument to this point. White Americans could, see this as them fighting for equality. I definitely see that point, and I definitely see the alarming point, but I only see it because of the context in which this was written. I know this was written in a very hostile time in America. I know there were a lot of issues. There were a lot of white versus black conflicts, which still, I don't want to say don't exist today. They do exist today, but in different ways. I think a lot more was gotten away with then. I would like to think so, but although this isn't always the case, especially, if you see recent videos that have been coming out. But this was an issue that was on the forefront of everything in the 1960s, as where now it's an issue that's kind of, it's still an issue, but it's in the dark. Most people aren't paying attention to this thing, or they're not even aware that it's happening. So, alarming people back then, especially when everybody was like, in this conversation, makes more sense. So you have to think of context, is what I'm trying to say. Notice and note, Baldwin uses uncompromising language to support his message about race in America. How does this kind of language add strength to his argument? What impact does it have on his audience? Now, to answer this question, you needed to look at your annotations. We're talking about uncompromising language. So what does that mean? If you compromise with something, it means you concede to a point, or you find an agreement, right? If we compromise, if I compromise with you about grades, I'm like, okay, you're asking me for 2 marks higher. I'm like, okay, I'll give you 1 mark higher. That's my compromise. He's not compromising. He's like, no, this is what I'm saying. This is what it is. So how does this type of language add strength to his argument? In order to answer this question, you should look at uncompromising language. You can find a lot of examples where instead of saying, for example, instead of saying maybe this is the case, he says this is the case, So for the sake of time, I'm going to give you a briefer response than what you should have had, but I do want to try to help you with this response briefly. And what I meant by looking at your annotations, hopefully if I can get mine up. Okay, here we go. One of the annotations was extreme or absolute language. So anytime, the reason why I have you guys do the annotations and why I tell you to take your time is because they always help you do a closer analysis of the actual text. The great thing about our book is that these annotations are guided. Like it says in paragraph 3, mark phrases where Baldwin expresses extreme certainty or uncompromising position. Okay, great. That tells you exactly what you're looking for. Unlike what we have been working on in class, where there's no degree of certainty. It's like, maybe, question mark? I kind of see this, right? So where is the uncompromising language? In this one, it is here. For most of them do not yet really know that you exist. I know, notice the emphasis here, the italicized text. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Okay, so this is uncompromising language. We do have the emphasis on no or not. He's confident in what he's saying. The sentence before this, most of them do not yet really know that you exist. He's making an assumption there, but he's not letting you know that it's assumption. He's saying this is it. They don't know you exist. Well, certainly some people know he exists. It's not like somebody's born and they're just ghosted, right? We recognize other people. Okay, so this would be an example of uncompromising language, and you can find other examples all throughout the text. Your response, if you used explicit textual evidence, should reference something along those lines, but should look something like this. If I can find my response, give me a second. So, the uncompromising language conveys Baldwin's certainty and courage, thereby adding power and emphasis to his message. If you, and we've talked about this with writing, if you say, well, it's possible that this means this, you add a level of uncertainty and you make your writing weaker. But if you say, this is the cause, and this is why this, 2 + 2 = 4, then people believe you, right? A really good example of this is Donald Trump, right? He says some things that make people go, huh? But he says them with such confidence that a lot of people believe it, right? And it's no different. If you say something, there's an expression, fake it till you make it. If you say something with confidence and you act like you're right, people will believe that you're right. For example, my favorite thing is Mr. Ali, who he once convinced people that we worked with that he used to make carpets in the northern part of Pakistan, and that's how he met Mr. Jawad. But the funny thing is, and he talks about how poor he was, and they barely ate and making these carpets. He had these people completely convinced that boy has never made carpets in his life. But he said it with such certainty and such confidence that people believed him, right? So again, this certainty adds power and adds emphasis. Now, it also encourages his audience to take his message seriously and to draw on their own strength and courage. And again, your response should have explicit textual evidence. Mine does not for time's sake. We're coming to the end of our class time. I hope that you found this video helpful. I tried to walk you through these questions. As we do more of the readings and these type of questions in the future, although that might be in a couple weeks, I expect your answers to be as full, if not fuller, than these ones are. You should not be turning in 1 or 2 sentences, okay? You should have full responses. If you look at even the simplest question, we have almost a paragraph, right? We have, 4 or 5 sentences there. And that's the way every response should be. Think like you're writing an essay. You have to fully defend yourself in everything. Okay? Hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. I hope you found it really helpful, and I'll see you next class.